Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at Luke 16:10. And this one's really for all you pastors and Bible study leaders out there. We all know this verse, but how do we bring it to life? How do we find those uncommon angles that will really resonate with our congregations?
Well, what's interesting is we analyzed a bunch of sermons on Luke 16:10 using AI. And you know what? The themes were all over the place.
Hmm.
We've got obedience, small acts, having a big impact, quiet living, and get this, a connection to the Challenger disaster.
Yeah, Challenger disaster. I got to hear that one.
Mhm.
But first, let's talk about something that popped up in a lot of these sermons. Faithfulness in the everyday stuff. Dream City Church used this analogy of a 5K race.
Yeah, they were saying it's not just about showing up on race day, right?
Yeah.
It's about the training, the daily discipline. That's what really matters.
It's less about feeling guilty and more about being intentional.
Exactly. And Connecting Point Church, they took it even further. They tied this idea to Joshua 5, where the Israelites had to be circumcised before entering the Promised Land.
Interesting. So how do they connect that back to Luke 16:10? What was the takeaway for their congregation?
Well, they said, just like the Israelites couldn't enter the Promised Land carrying all that baggage from their past, we can't fully experience God's blessings if we're holding on to shame or unconfessed sin. You see, obedience, even in the small things, it's a way of cleansing ourselves, making space for God to work.
Makes you think about those little acts of obedience we might be putting off,
Yeah.
maybe even subconsciously, and how those could be blocking us from what God really wants to do in our lives and ministries. What about you? Do you have a Joshua 5 area, something you've been putting off?
Wow, that's a good question. And honestly, something I wrestle with too, I think for me, it's about being more intentional with my time, making space for quiet and solitude. I know it's important, but I get so caught up in the busyness of ministry.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yes.
It's easy to get lost in the doing and forget about the being.
Yeah.
But then we've got Evolve Church. They come in with this really strong message, delayed obedience, disobedience. They even use the example of folding towels.
Right. Who actually likes folding towels? But it's so relatable. They were saying that neglecting those small everyday tasks, it can become a habit, a pattern of ignoring God's call in bigger areas.
And then they brought up the Challenger disaster. That one tiny O-ring failing and causing the whole thing to explode.
Yeah.
Do you think people really connect those small things to their spiritual lives, though?
It's such a powerful image. It makes you stop and think about the consequences of ignoring those little nudges from God. It's easy to dismiss them, but they can have a ripple effect, both in our own lives and the lives of those around us.
It's a wake-up call, for sure. It reminds us that it's not just about the task itself. It's about the state of our hearts. Are we truly willing to surrender to God's will, even in the smallest details?
It's about being sensitive to the Holy Spirit, recognizing that faithfulness can show up anywhere, even in folding towels.
Okay. So we've been talking about faithfulness in our actions. But the Rolect.Church, they broadened it out.
Yeah.
They said Luke 16:10 isn't just about money or chores. It's about everything. Our relationships, our thoughts, even how we treat the cashier at the grocery store.
And that's where it gets tough, because it's not just external anymore. It's about cultivating a mindset of faithfulness, a constant awareness of God's presence, a desire to honor Him in every single thing we do.
That's a high standard.
Yeah.
How do we even preach that kind of comprehensive faithfulness without overwhelming people?
I think it starts with helping them identify those small things in their own lives, where they can practice faithfulness. Maybe it's being more patient with the difficult coworker, or resisting the urge to gossip. It's about starting small and building from there.
Right. It's those little daily choices that shape us, make us more like Christ.
And it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. We're all going to mess up. We're all going to fall short.
Yeah.
But God's grace lets us start fresh every day.
Speaking of grace, let's talk about quiet faithfulness. Crazy Love Church really dug into this. They said God rewards what's done in secret, not for the applause. They tied it to living simply working with your hands, almost like a countercultural message in today's world.
Definitely challenges the way we think about success and recognition, especially in ministry. Makes you examine your motives. Are you serving God for the accolades? Or are you content to work diligently even if no one ever sees it?
That's a tough one. As pastors and leaders, we're kind of in the spotlight.
Yeah.
How do we balance that with this idea of quiet faithfulness?
It's a tension for sure, but I think the key is remembering who our audience is. It's God, not people. We're seeking His approval, not the approval of others. And that might mean making some tough choices, especially in the age of social media and this constant pressure to perform.
It might mean saying no to some opportunities, stepping back from the spotlight, even when it feels counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's about trusting that God sees our hearts. He values faithfulness more than outward appearances.
And that kind of faithfulness, it often has a ripple effect. It might not be flashy, but it has this quiet power that can change lives.
Like that verse in 1 Thessalonians 4:11-12 about living quiet lives, minding our own affairs, working with our hands. Almost a subversive message in a culture that's all about noise and self-promotion.
It's a powerful reminder that true faithfulness isn't about seeking recognition. It's about serving God and loving others. It's about those small, everyday acts of kindness and integrity that often go unnoticed but have an incredible impact.
So we've talked about faithfulness in the everyday, the importance of obedience even when it's delayed, and the power of quiet faithfulness. What else stood out to you from these sermons?
Well, Evolved Church had another point that really resonated with me. They said, we need to stop chasing after new revelations and focus on obeying the ones we already have. They use this analogy of a hunting guide versus a GPS.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does a hunting guide compare to a GPS?
Well, a GPS just gives you directions, but a hunting guide walks with you, teaches you, knows the terrain. They were saying that divine guidance is more about the relationship with God than just finding the right path.
It's not about information overload. It's about intimacy, learning to hear his voice.
Exactly. And it shifts the focus from seeking something new to deepening our understanding of what we already know. It's about going deeper, not wider, in our spiritual walk.
It's about putting into practice what God's already shown us, instead of constantly looking for the next big thing. Sometimes the most profound revelations come from simply being faithful to what we already know.
And allowing God to unpack those truths over time, it's not instant gratification. It's that slow, steady work of transformation.
Which reminds me of something Church said. They use the story of David and Goliath to illustrate how God often works through the small and seemingly insignificant. They said just like David chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, we need to be selective with our resources and trust that God can multiply them.
That's a great point. It's not about having the biggest or the best. It's about being faithful with what we have, even if it seems small or inadequate.
And it connects back to that quiet faithfulness, right? David wasn't looking for fame or recognition. He was just obeying God. And in doing so, he achieved something incredible.
It reminds us that God can use anyone, regardless of their background or resources, if they're willing to be faithful. It challenges us to reevaluate what we think is important and trust that God can do amazing things with our simple acts of obedience.
It's a message we all need to hear, especially ministry. It's so easy to get caught up in the pressure to perform, to build bigger and better programs, to have all the answers.
But in the end, it's not about our efforts. It's about God's grace, surrendering to His will, trusting that He'll equip us for whatever He calls us to do.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring faithfulness in the everyday, the importance of obedience even when it's delayed, the power of quiet faithfulness, and God working through the small. We've heard about 5K races, folding towels, even a connection to the Challenger disaster.
And what's amazing is all these different themes and illustrations, they're all pointing us back to the same truth. Faithfulness matters. It matters in the small things. It matters in the quiet moments. It matters when no one is watching.
And as we move into part 2, we're going to explore the other side of that coin. What does it look like when we're not faithful? What happens when we neglect those small acts of obedience or try to build our ministries on our own strength?
It's a question we might not want to ask, but it's essential for our growth and maturity as pastors and leaders.
Stay tuned, because things are about to get really interesting.
Picking up where we left off, we were talking about being faithful and all, but let's flip the script for a minute. What about the unfaithful servant in Luke 16:10? It's easy to focus on the good stuff, being diligent, trustworthy. But the other side, the potential for unfaithfulness, that's important too.
Yeah, it's like that saying, sin is crouching at the door. We can't just assume we're immune to it, especially as pastors and leaders. We got to be on guard, even in those little areas that seem insignificant.
Absolutely, and that's the tough part, right? It's usually not the big dramatic sins that trip us up. It's those subtle compromises, the rationalizations, the little white lies we tell ourselves.
The just this once mentality.
Yes.
Or no one will even notice, and before you know it, you're sliding down a slippery slope.
Exactly. That's why Luke 16:10 hits so hard. It reminds us that faithfulness isn't just about the big moments. It's about the everyday grind, the choices we make when no one's watching, the little things that no one else might see.
It makes me think about those hidden sins, the ones we try to bury deep down. Maybe it's gossip, envy, resentment. Those things can really fester if we don't deal with them.
It's funny because sometimes those hidden sins can actually masquerade as good behavior. Maybe we're super dedicated to ministry, but it's driven by a need for approval or a fear of failure, not real love for God or a desire to serve.
Or maybe we're really generous with our money, But it's because we're trying to earn God's favor or impress people, not because we truly understand grace and stewardship.
Right. And those are powerful things to talk about in our sermons. It's about challenging our congregations to look deeper, to examine their motives, to make sure their actions line up with their hearts.
It's about being honest with ourselves, confessing those hidden sins, even if it's painful.
Because God sees everything. He knows our hearts better than we do. And he's not impressed with outward performance if our hearts aren't right.
That's a sobering thought. So how do we preach on this unfaithfulness thing in a way that's engaging and impactful, but without being judgmental or preachy?
We could use stories from the Bible. People who fell into the trap of unfaithfulness. David and Bathsheba, Samson, Judas, even Peter denying Jesus.
Those stories really grab you because they show that even the heroes of the faith messed up. It's a reminder that we're all human. We all need God's grace.
And we can use those stories to show the consequences of unfaithfulness. It's not about being preachy. It's about showing that our choices have real impact on ourselves and the people around us.
It's about helping people see that unfaithfulness isn't just some abstract concept. It has real consequences in our lives and relationships.
Exactly. And we can also talk about those more subtle ways unfaithfulness creeps in. As pastors and leaders, maybe neglecting our families because we're so busy with church, or being dishonest about our struggles because we're afraid of what people will think.
Or maybe holding on to bitterness towards someone, or gossiping about people in the church. Those might seem small, but they can really damage our integrity and our witness.
And create a toxic environment. If we're not living out faithfulness in our own lives, how can we expect our congregations to do the same?
Good point. It reminds us that Luke 16:10 applies to everything, not just the spiritual stuff.
Yeah.
How we treat our spouses, handle money, interact with our neighbors. It all matters to God.
Because faithfulness is about reflecting God's character in everything we do. Being trustworthy, reliable, honest, even when it's hard.
Okay, so we've talked about this unfaithful servant idea, but let's switch gears again. What about the faithful servant? The one who is trustworthy, the one who does use their resources wisely. What blessings can they expect?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to remember that the rewards of faithfulness, they're not always material or immediate. Sometimes the greatest reward is simply knowing we've pleased God, lived according to his will.
It's that peace that passes all understanding, that deep satisfaction of knowing you've been obedient, even when it was tough.
Exactly. But the Bible also talks about tangible blessings, peace, joy, a sense of purpose, even material abundance. It's not about a prosperity gospel. It's about recognizing that God cares about our well-being and wants to bless us.
And those blessings, they often come in unexpected ways. A new opportunity, a deeper relationship, a sense of clarity and direction.
It's about trusting that God sees our faithfulness, even when no one else does, and that he'll reward us in his time.
And those rewards, they're not just for us. They benefit everyone around us, our families, our churches, our communities.
It's like a ripple effect, spreading outward from our obedience. It's about making a difference in the world, being part of something bigger than ourselves.
So how can we encourage our congregations to embrace this faithfulness mindset? Not just in the big things, but in the everyday.
Start with small steps. It's easy to get overwhelmed by trying to be faithful in every area. But if we break it down, it's less daunting.
Maybe we challenge people to pick one area where they want to grow in faithfulness. Finances, relationships, time management, whatever God's putting on their hearts.
And then encourage those small, consistent steps. Setting a budget, spending quality time, being more intentional with their time.
Celebrating those small victories. Recognizing that progress, not perfection, is the goal.
And reminding them they're not alone. God is with them, empowering them, blessing their efforts.
This has been a really great conversation. We've explored the pitfalls of unfaithfulness and the rewards of faithfulness, and we've seen how Luke 16:10 challenges us to look at our hearts and actions in every area. But before we wrap up this part, I want to throw out a question. What about the things we don't have?
That's an interesting one. You mean talents or resources we wish we had?
Exactly. Is there a form of faithfulness in acknowledging our limitations, being content with what God's given us, trusting him to use us even when we feel inadequate? So we're back, digging deeper into Luke 16:10. And we've been talking about faithfulness, the good and the bad. And now we're wrestling with something kind of uncomfortable. What about the things we lack? You know, those talents, resources, opportunities that seem just out of reach. Is there faithfulness in admitting that we're not perfect?
It's a tricky one, right? As pastors, we want to project confidence, have all the answers. But what if part of being faithful is admitting we don't have it all figured out?
Yeah, it's tough because we're supposed to be the strong ones. But it reminds me of Moses. You know, he initially pushed back against God, Said he wasn't a good speaker, but God used him anyway, even
Yeah.
gave him Aaron to do the talking. Maybe there's something there about surrendering our weaknesses to God.
That's such a good example. It's not about pretending our limitations don't exist. It's about trusting God to work through them, even using them for his glory. Takes the pressure off, right? We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be willing.
Willing to say, hey, God, I don't have this, but I trust you.
That's a powerful message, especially today, when the world's telling us we need to be more, do more, have more.
Totally. It's countercultural, but it's also so freeing, you know? It gets us out of that comparison game, that pressure to be something we're not. It lets us rest in God's grace and be who he created us to be.
And in that surrender, in admitting what we lack, we might actually find that our weaknesses become strengths.
Exactly. Maybe it's through our struggles that we connect with others who are hurting. Maybe our lack of resources forces us to be more creative, rely on God in new ways. There's something beautiful about that. When we realize God doesn't need us to be perfect, he just needs us to be faithful with what we have, even if it seems small.
And sometimes the most faithful thing is to step aside. Let God work through someone else. It's not about ego. It's about recognizing we're all part of the same team, each with our own gifts.
Maybe that's the real test of faithfulness, not just using what we have well, but knowing when to let go, trust others, embrace our limitations.
It's humbling, but it's also freeing. It lets us focus on what really matters. Loving God, serving others, reflecting his character.
This has been quite a journey. We've talked about faithfulness in the everyday, the power of small acts, the danger of hidden sins, even the faithfulness in admitting our weaknesses. We've heard about 5K races, folding towels, even the Challenger disaster.
It's been a great conversation, and I hope our listeners are walking away with a new understanding of Luke 16:10.
It's a verse that keeps on giving. Every time you dig into it, there's something new to discover.
So as you go back to your congregations with all these fresh insights, remember this: faithfulness isn't a destination, it's a journey, a lifelong pursuit of becoming more like Christ, one step at a time.
And even when we mess up, when we fall short, God's grace is always there to pick us up and get us back on track.
So go out there, preach with boldness, with passion, with a deep understanding of what faithfulness really means. And don't forget to share your own sermon ideas inspired by this deep dive. We're all learning from each other.
Until next time, keep digging deep, keep asking questions, and keep letting the word challenge and inspire you.